Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to explore the connection between indigenous land rights and protecting the diversity of life on Earth. We hear about biodiversity, but what does it really look like on the ground? And what role do indigenous communities play in protecting it?
It's a fascinating topic and one
Yeah.
that's gaining a lot more recognition, especially with the recent global biodiversity framework.
Right. That agreement has a goal of protecting 30% of the planet's land and water by 2030. And it seems like indigenous communities are absolutely essential to reaching that goal.
Absolutely. What many people don't realize is that indigenous peoples and local communities already steward over 50% of the world's land. Think about that for a second. Over half of the Earth's land is cared for by people who have lived in harmony with nature for generations.
It's like we're finally catching up to what indigenous communities have known all along. Our deep dive today is based on a recent article from the World Resources Institute. It's called Protecting Biodiversity Hinges on Securing Indigenous and Community Land Rights. And it really dives deep into why recognizing these rights isn't just about fairness, it's actually crucial for protecting all the amazing life on our planet.
The article starts by focusing on something called intact forest landscapes. These are essentially vast stretches of uninterrupted forest that are vital for maintaining healthy ecosystems. They act as a shield against climate change, and they store tons of carbon and are home to countless species.
And the article points out that 54% of these intact forests are found on lands held or managed by indigenous peoples. That's over half of the world's most pristine forests being protected by communities who are deeply connected to the land. Why do you think that is?
It's a testament to the deep knowledge and sustainable practices that have been passed down through generations. For indigenous communities, protecting the land isn't just a responsibility, it's a way of life. Their cultural practices and beliefs are often intertwined with the natural world. It fosters a sense of respect and stewardship that's been lost in many other parts of the world.
That really shines through in the article's example of the Seneca tribe in Suriname. They're actually using satellite technology to monitor their land and protect it from illegal logging and development. It's a perfect example of how traditional knowledge and modern technology can work together.
It is inspiring to see communities like the Samaka taking such an active role in protecting their land. It highlights the point that indigenous peoples aren't just passive beneficiaries of conservation, they are leading the way.
And the stewardship extends beyond just forests. The article also highlights key biodiversity areas. These are places on Earth that are absolutely critical for the survival of many species.
Think of them as hotspots of life,
Yeah.
teeming with unique plants and animals found nowhere else.
And guess what? 43% of these key biodiversity areas overlap with indigenous lands. That connection is hard to ignore. It makes you wonder what's going on in these areas that leads to such thriving biodiversity.
Well, the article highlights some compelling research on that front. A study conducted in Australia, Brazil, and Canada found that the biodiversity on indigenous managed lands was equal to or even higher than in government-managed protected areas.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. It seems like indigenous knowledge and practices are incredibly effective at protecting biodiversity. The article actually uses a term called biodiversity intactness to measure how much wildlife thrives in a given area without significant human impact.
It's essentially a gauge of how well an ecosystem is functioning. And unsurprisingly, indigenous and local community lands consistently rank in the top 10% for biodiversity intactness globally.
It's amazing to see that reflected in the data, but why do you think that is? What makes these lands so special?
It goes back to that deep connection to the land and generations of traditional knowledge. Think about old-growth forests for a moment. Those ancient towering forests that have stood for centuries untouched by industrial logging. They play an absolutely crucial role in maintaining biodiversity, not to mention their ability to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, helping to mitigate climate change.
And the article makes a point that these old growth forests are often found on indigenous managed lands. It seems like a pretty clear connection, right? Protecting these lands isn't just about respecting cultural heritage, it's about protecting the planet as a whole.
It's really about recognizing that indigenous peoples are on the front lines of conservation, and they've been doing this work for far longer than any government program or international agreement.
Okay, so we've established that indigenous communities are vital to protecting biodiversity, but the article also brings up a pretty big concern, doesn't it?
It does. While the global biodiversity framework encourages countries to respect indigenous rights, the reality is that there's a huge gap between words and action.
The article points out that only a small percentage of indigenous lands are actually legally recognized. Most are held under customary tenure systems, which often aren't acknowledged by governments.
Exactly. And that's a huge risk. Without legal recognition, these lands are vulnerable to exploitation. Think about it. Mining companies, logging operations, even well-intentioned conservation projects that don't fully consider indigenous rights can end up displacing communities and damaging the very ecosystems they're trying to protect.
The article even mentions that up to 300 million people could be forced from their homelands if conservation efforts don't prioritize indigenous rights. That's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? We could end up doing more harm than good if we don't get this right.
It's a stark reminder that conservation can't be separated from human rights. Protecting biodiversity means protecting the people who've been safeguarding it for generations.
So, what can be done? What does the article suggest in terms of bridging this gap between policy and reality?
The article emphasizes the need for legally recognizing indigenous land rights. It's not just about acknowledging their role. It's about giving them legal ownership of their lands, empowering them to make decisions about how those lands are managed and protected.
That makes a lot of sense. Legal ownership gives them a seat at the table, right? It gives them the power to say no to harmful projects and to ensure that any economic activities on their lands benefit their communities.
Precisely. It's about shifting the power dynamics and ensuring that indigenous peoples have control over their own destinies and the future of their lands.
The article does point to a few positive examples, though, right?
Yes, there are some encouraging signs. Australia, for instance, is taking some promising steps. Their 2024 to 2030 plan includes provisions for First Nations peoples' participation in decisions related to nature conservation.
It sounds like they're trying to build a model that recognizes indigenous knowledge and leadership in conservation. Hopefully, other countries will follow suit.
That's the hope. But the article also stresses the importance of accountability. It's not enough to just make promises. We need to see concrete action and measurable progress. Governments need to track and report their progress on securing indigenous land rights and demonstrate that they are truly committed to upholding these rights.
Transparency is key, right? It allows us to hold governments accountable and ensure that they're following through on their commitments.
Absolutely. And it's not just governments that have a role to play. The article also encourages individuals and communities to get involved. They highlight a platform called Landmark.
Landmark, what's that?
Landmark is an incredible resource. It's a global platform that maps the extent of indigenous and community lands and provides data on key biodiversity indicators. It's a powerful tool for understanding the connections between land rights and conservation, and it's available to anyone with an internet connection.
So you're telling me I could go online right now and see for myself the incredible overlap between indigenous lands and areas of high biodiversity.
You absolutely could. It's a great way to visualize the importance of these lands and the urgent need to protect them.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening so far. I think the thing that really sticks with me is just how interconnected these issues are. Indigenous land rights, biodiversity, climate change, human rights. It's all part of the same tapestry.
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just about protecting a species or preserving a forest. It's about recognizing the intricate web of life and ensuring that all its threads are strong and resilient.
It's a lot to take in for sure, but I think you've really highlighted the key message here. Protecting biodiversity isn't just about setting aside land for conservation. It's about empowering the people who are already doing the work, who are already living in a way that respects and sustains the natural world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that indigenous peoples hold a wealth of knowledge and experience that is essential for addressing the environmental challenges we face today. And it's about ensuring that their voices are heard and their rights are respected.
It feels like we're at a turning point. There's this growing awareness of the importance of indigenous land rights and the role they play in conservation, but at the same time, there's still this massive gap between acknowledging those rights and actually protecting them.
You've put your finger right on the heart of the issue. The global biodiversity framework has the potential to be a game changer, but it all comes down to how it's implemented.
It's one thing to have an agreement with ambitious targets, but it's another thing entirely to actually make those targets a reality. What needs to happen to make sure this framework isn't just another empty promise?
It requires a fundamental shift in how we approach conservation. We need to move away from these top-down exclusionary models and embrace indigenous-led conservation. Instead of viewing indigenous communities as passive beneficiaries, we need to recognize them as the leaders and experts they truly are.
It's about recognizing that they aren't just protecting nature. They're protecting their homes, their livelihoods, their cultures, their very existence, and they've been doing it successfully for centuries.
Exactly. The evidence is clear. Indigenous-led conservation works. Their deep understanding of the land, their sustainable practices, their spiritual connection to nature. All of this makes them incredibly effective stewards of biodiversity.
So what can we do? As individuals, as communities, how can we support this shift toward indigenous-led conservation?
That's the question we should all be asking ourselves. It starts with awareness. We need to educate ourselves about these issues, learn from indigenous communities, and amplify their voices.
The landmark platform you mentioned earlier seems like a great place to start.
It is. It's a treasure trove of information that can help us understand the extent of indigenous lands, the threats they face, and the incredible biodiversity they protect.
But awareness is just the first step, right? What else can we do to turn that awareness into action?
We need to start holding our governments accountable. Demand that they implement the global biodiversity framework in a way that truly respects and upholds indigenous rights. Support organizations that are working on the ground to secure land tenure for indigenous communities, and most importantly, listen to indigenous voices. Let them lead the way.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from understanding the crucial link between indigenous land rights and biodiversity to exploring the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
And ultimately, I hope it sparked a sense of urgency. This isn't just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue. It's about recognizing the inherent rights of indigenous peoples and supporting their efforts to protect the planet for all of us.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. Before we go, is there one final thought-provoking question we can leave our listener with? Something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
Given the overwhelming evidence that indigenous-led conservation is effective, how can we as individuals and communities advocate for greater financial and political support for these initiatives? How can we shift the power dynamics to ensure that indigenous voices are truly heard and their leadership is supported in the fight to protect our planet's biodiversity?
Powerful questions indeed, and ones we should all be grappling with. Thanks for joining us on this incredibly important deep dive. Don't forget to check out the Landmark platform, which is linked in the show notes. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.